We sing the song of the redeemed. We shall assemble on the mountain. We shall assemble at the throne, with humble hearts into his presence. We bring an offering of song, glory and honor and dominion unto our Lamb, unto the King, unto the Lamb, unto the King. Oh, hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. We sing the song of the redeemed. He paid a debt he did not owe. I own a debt I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away. And now I sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. Christ Jesus paid a debt that I could never pay. He paid that debt at Calvary. He cleansed my soul and set me free. I'm glad that Jesus did all my sins erase. I now can sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. Christ Jesus paid a debt that I could never pay. One day he's coming back for me to live with him eternally. Won't it be glory to see him on that day? I then will sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. Christ Jesus paid a debt that I could never pay.
As the deer thirsts for the water, Lord, so my soul longs after you. My soul thirsts for the living God. Yes, my soul longs after you. And I pour out my soul deep within me. Deep within me, I pour out my soul. Draw me deeper.
Test. Test. Okay. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know it's early, but let me tell you why. I know the children's classes have gotten started, and I have helped in my wife's 2-year-old class a few times. And I think that little children have clocks built into them, because when they've been in their class 40, 45 minutes, they know it's time to go. It doesn't matter what the clock says. Their internal clock says it's time to go. So what I'm getting at is they've already started, and those little kids are going to be let out at about 11:25. So if we don't get started, we're not going to have any class because there will be children and parents running loose in the you know how that gets. And I want to say thank you to Henry, and I think Sal helped him pass out things this morning. I stepped out for a moment, come back, I was ready to hand everything out, and I look around, and y'all have already got them. So that was nice. All right, we'll start in chapter 11 of Acts, verse 19, and then we'll go through the rest of 11 all the way through 12. There are basically 3 stories this morning: the church in Antioch, Peter's imprisonment, and the death of Herod. So let's just go ahead and dive in. Verse 19, those who had been scattered by persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, spreading the word only among Jews. Some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began to speak to Greeks also, telling them the good news about the Lord Jesus. I got to thinking about verse 20 this week, and I'm wondering if maybe if I was wrong and too harsh about the Jews last week. Remember I asked you how long would it have been before the Jews started talking to Gentiles? And, I said I figured it would be hundreds of years at best. And some of y'all were saying they probably never would. Well, here's the problem. We don't know if the people that went to Antioch and started talking to Gentiles did that after Cornelius was converted, and then thus knew that God thought it was okay to reach out to Gentiles, or if they started doing it after Stephen was killed. See, Cornelius is chapter 8, Cornelius is chapter 10, Stephen's chapter 8. If they were scattered after Stephen, they might have been doing this before Cornelius was converted. We just don't know how it worked. I would point you to verse 19, though. You see what it says about most of them? Talking to Jews only. So, there was still, regardless of verse 20, there was still some hesitation on the part of Jews to reach out to Gentiles. I want you to notice how what I just called Jesus movement here, I want you to notice how it's changed. In the beginning, when it was Jesus and his disciples, it was mostly rural. Up in Galilee, there weren't any big cities there. There were smaller towns, Nazareth and so on. They were not large places. Then it gets centered in Jerusalem. Well, that's a pretty good-sized urban location, but it's all Jew, right? Or predominantly Jew. There were some Gentiles in Jerusalem, but it's overwhelmingly Jewish. So it's kind of a mono-ethnic situation, just one ethnicity there. Now it goes up to Antioch and has success in a huge, for those times, a huge city that was very cosmopolitan. People from everywhere lived in Antioch. Ideas and religions from everywhere found a home in Antioch. And the church was able to flourish in all 3 of those settings. If you study antiquity, you know that's something that just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. That a new movement can find a home in all of these different kinds of places among all these different kinds of people. I think there's 2 reasons for that. First, during the time between the Testaments, Jews scattered all over what became known as the Roman Empire. And the church started among Jews, right? And where did Paul go first anytime he went to a new town? Where the Jews were, because they all had something in common. So, and the Jews that lived there, they had to know how to deal with people that lived around them. So the church kind of had half of a foothold simply because of the Jews living in all these different places. But I think it even more, though, speaks to the power of God. It speaks to the power of God in the gospel that appealed to everybody, everywhere. All right, so now let's talk about the city of Antioch. This is sometimes called Antioch on the Orontes. The Orontes is a river that runs through Antioch. It's to distinguish it from other Antiochs. You'll see how many there were in just a moment. It was founded by one of Alexander's generals. Remember, Alexander died. His empire got broken up into 4 parts. Well, a fellow named Seleucus Nicator, was one of Alexander's generals, and he took over the area of what we call Turkey and modern-day Syria and parts of Jordan and Palestine and so on. It was the capital of what was called the Seleucid Empire. And remember I told you a few weeks ago about that guy Antiochus Epiphanes? Nicknamed himself God Made Manifest, tried to wipe out the Jewishness of the Jews. Well, he eventually was one of the fellows that ruled in Antioch. He's about 3 or 4 down from the founder. Seleucus named the city Antioch either after his father, that's probable, but possibly after his son, both of whom were named Antiochus. Seleucus built 16 cities that he named Antioch. At least 16. That's why we sometimes call this one Antioch on the Orontes. Now, you know, if you remember the rest of Acts, doesn't Paul go to another Antioch over in Asia Minor, right? So, you know, sometimes we call this an Antioch of Syria. You know, it can get confusing to keep where you're talking about straight because 16 of them. Okay? Now, it was the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire, Antioch was. Rome first, Alexandria and Egypt second, Antioch third. Population, the guesses range between 100,000 to 600,000. Probably on the lower end of that scale. I would say somewhere more between 200,000 and 300,000 likely. Now, for us, that's not a huge city. You know, when we talk about a huge city, we're talking in multiples of millions, right? For that day and age, 200,000 people living in the same place was enormous. Most people in the world couldn't even imagine that many people in the same geographic area. Rome declared Antioch a free city, which allowed it to mostly govern itself, which meant that things could be a little bit looser, perhaps, than they would have been if you're under direct Roman rule. Antioch was known for its pagan religious diversity. Everything religious found a home in Antioch. Now, would that possibly help the coming of the church? I mean, if people are wide open to religious ideas, even if they just saw the church as another new religious ideas, at least they might listen to it or be interested in what it was, because that's kind of what they did there. The wide mix of cultures in Antioch meant that Jews were not discriminated against as they were in other places. In Alexandria, for example, Jews were segregated to what we might as well call a ghetto. And there were other cities in the Roman Empire where that was the case. In in Antioch, Jews mixed freely, which again would allow the church made up of primarily Jews to start with to mix freely in the culture. The estimates are that there were about 20,000 Jews in Antioch. So maybe as much as 10% of the population. It means they were, you know, it's a pretty sizable minority if you're looking to plant a foothold. It was a city that was ready for the gospel. All the religious diversity meant that the story of Jesus would at least be listened to. But notice that Luke tells us there were many proselytes and God-fearers who attended the synagogue there. Now, we've talked about the God-fearers before. People who are ready for the God of the Jews, but don't quite want to become Jews with all the laws and everything else. And when they hear the story of Jesus, that you get the God of the Jews without all the negative stuff, they're ready. I mean, they grab hold and run with it. It's interesting to me that in Acts chapter 6, verse 5, when the 7 men are selected to distribute food to the widows, one of them is Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. And he's one of many proselytes that were just like the God-fearers, ready to hear the gospel. So the church in Antioch, verse 21. Some of the people from Jerusalem get scattered up there, and the Lord's hand was with them. A great number of people believed and turned to the Lord. So they have a great response. Just immediately, you've got, I don't know if I should say dozens or hundreds, but it was a lot of new Christians there. And the apostles in Jerusalem hear about it. They send Barnabas up to see what's going on. Now, I don't think this was an inspection tour so much, although I'm sure that Barnabas was strong enough in the faith that if anything was wrong, he would have been able to correct it. Think about what we know about Barnabas. What's his nickname? son of the encourager, son of encouragement. Barnabas the encourager. He's the one who's ready to see the best in everyone. He's the one that reaches down to lift somebody up and help them achieve more. Is that the kind of guy you'd want to send to a baby church? Somebody that would encourage them, somebody that would kind of gently push them along to be more than they thought they could be? Look at verse 23 and 24. When he arrived, that's Barnabas, saw what the grace of God had done, he was glad, encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. It sounds like Barnabas' presence led to even more conversions. And take a look again at verse 24. If that was the epitaph on my tombstone, I would be happy. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith. Barnabas is working there, though, verse 25, and he realizes he needs help. There is so much going on so fast that they've got this opportunity, and he's not enough by himself to exploit the opportunity. So he decides to go get Saul. Now, more about that in a second. He's going to go up to Tarsus to find Saul. That's about a 100-mile journey. But remember, this is the day and age where most of your transportation was done on foot. And you're going through mountain passes to get up to Tarsus from Antioch. Think about that. It would have taken Barnabas quite a while to get to Tarsus and back, meaning that he would lose all that time that he could be ministering in Antioch. What does that tell you about what he thought Paul could offer if he was willing to give up that much of his own time ministering there to go bring Paul down? Why does he think Paul could be a help? Well, remember back in chapter 9. Who was it that told the apostles that Paul was now one of us, or Saul was now one of us? It's okay. It was Barnabas. I don't know that Barnabas had been with Paul in Damascus, because after Paul was converted, or when Saul was converted, he started preaching immediately and was very powerful in Damascus. I don't know that Barnabas heard any of that, but I bet he heard of it. He already knew that Paul had been very, very successful in preaching the gospel. Now, Barnabas likely wasn't aware of what I'm about to tell you, but I want you to think more about Paul himself. Galatians chapter 1 talks about a 3-year period, somehow split between Damascus and by himself in Arabia, out in the desert. We don't know exactly what, when, all, when, but there's 3 years there that have happened before Paul goes to Tarsus. And then we don't know how long he's actually been up in Tarsus. A couple, 3 years, 4 or 5, we don't know. My point is, what do you think Paul's been doing all this time? He's been studying the scriptures. He's been rethinking everything he knows about the Messiah in light of the fact that Jesus is the Messiah, right? Do you reckon he talked to people in Tarsus about Jesus? And remember, that's a Gentile city. So he's likely already been reaching out to Gentiles and trying to explain the story of Jesus to them. He's been studying up, rehearsing his arguments, filling his bucket, and now Barnabas gets him and says, look, there is an explosion among Gentiles down in Antioch, and I want you to come help. And Paul's reaction had to have been, I'm ready. It's what I've been doing all these few years by myself. I'm ready. So he goes down to Antioch, and it just gets better and better and better. Now, around about this time, some prophets came up from Jerusalem, verse 27, and one of them, Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. And Luke notes that this happened during the reign of Claudius. For what it's worth, we know from history outside, historical record outside the Bible, that there was a severe famine during the time of Claudius. In fact, Claudius almost got lynched as a result of it. He was proceeding through Rome one day, and a mob attacked him, and they had to bring in additional, like the special forces unit had to come swoop in and rescue him because the mob was just about tearing him apart. See, Rome was so big, and there was no agriculture going on in Rome. They were dependent on food imports from the outside, and when the famine, we'll see more about that in a moment, The famine affected the food imports that got to Rome, and people were hungry. People were starving. I read once that you're only 3 missed meals away from the breakdown of civilization. Now, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but just think about it. What if there was literally no food in Coweta County and Fayette County? I don't care how much money you got. There is nothing for you to buy. How long before you got to start getting desperate? So, society breaks down pretty quickly, and Claudius almost got lynched because of it. Now, back in those times, everyone lived on the edge of famine. Rome was primarily dependent on grain that came from Egypt, and it was sailed across the Mediterranean up to Italy. And if you remember your ancient history, the Nile River would flood every year, and it would bring silt down from upstream, and it would leave the lands on both sides of the Nile very fertile. You didn't need fertilizer. You didn't need much of anything. You just plant the seeds and they grow. But what would cause the floods down low that provided that farmland? Rain upstream, right? What happens if it doesn't rain upstream? There's no flood. And you're trying to plant in last year's silt, and you've already used all the nutrients there. Stuff might grow, but not very much. Wouldn't be the yield that you needed, that you were used to. So when Egypt didn't produce grain, Rome starved. Egypt did too, but so did Rome. It was even worse in Israel. This is sort of a topographical map of Palestine. I want you to notice how much of the land is mountainous or hilly. You don't grow crops there. You just don't. Now, you were able to grow a little bit of crops up in this plain here in Galilee, a little more right here in southern Galilee. And then there was a little stretch of arable land right here between the mountains and the sea. But most of Palestine, you don't grow crops. You raise sheep, because sheep can survive almost anywhere. Hilly land doesn't bother them. Or perhaps you raise cattle. Now, if you go up, you kind of have to get off the map a little bit. You have the area called Bashan, and it was good agricultural land. The cattle there were known for being fat and happy. And you remember the study of Amos, that Amos compared the rich women in Samaria to the cows of Bashan because they were fat and sleek and anyway. You could also raise crops there. But most of Palestine proper, you didn't do a whole lot of agriculture. And what agriculture you did in these three places was highly dependent on the early and latter rains, as they called them. We would call it autumn and spring. For them, the early rains came in the autumn, and the latter rains came in the spring. It would rain, then you'd plant, and then it would rain some more after winter was over, and the crops would grow, and then you'd harvest. And in the best of years, they got just enough rain for the crops to grow. The best of years, just enough. So what does that tell you? It doesn't take too much interruption of the usual weather pattern, and people in Palestine start to go hungry. Now, the people in Antioch hear about the famine that's coming, and they take up a collection for the church in Jerusalem. For the church in Judea. You need to understand that if all of Palestine lived on a knife edge of hunger, it was even worse in Jerusalem, and worse for the church in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is up in the hills. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, Jerusalem is right here, up in the hills. There's nowhere to farm anywhere close to Jerusalem. All the food has to be brought from the outside. But if the rain's not right in the agricultural areas, there's no food to bring to Jerusalem. Now, think about the church. The Jerusalem church is still home to people that had showed up for Passover and Pentecost back in chapter 2 and never went home. And then we've had persecution. How many widows and orphans do you have in that church as a result of the persecution? People who are dependent on the church taking care of them. There's a reason why in all of Paul's letters he's constantly collecting for the church back in Jerusalem. Have you noticed that before? In 1 Corinthians, when he's talking about taking up a collection, it's for the church in Jerusalem. Now, I think that collection served to draw the Gentile and Jewish believers together. And you could certainly argue that the Gentile believers owed a debt to the Jewish believers, because who brought the gospel to Gentile believers? It was Jews, Jewish Christians. So, it may have brought them together, but it was also a very legitimate need because of the geography of Palestine and because of the nature of the church there. So they take up the collection, and in verse 30, they send their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. You don't let just anybody handle the money, do you? I don't care what organization you're talking about. I don't care if it's the Kiwanis Club or the church. Not just anybody handles the money. The fact that Paul and Barnabas were allowed to go off by themselves with a pretty substantial amount of money and travel where no one could watch them, it says something about the way they were trusted by the church there in Antioch. All right, Peter's escape from prison. Herod. This is Herod Agrippa I, to distinguish him from the other Herods. You'll see in a little bit that there were a bunch of them. But Herod the Great, is the one when Jesus is born. Then you have Herod Antipas through most of the Gospels. Well, this is now Herod Agrippa I. And it's Agrippa I because, you remember, Paul appears before an Agrippa later in Acts. Well, that's Herod Agrippa II. It would be nice if they chose different names for themselves, but they didn't do that. So this is Herod Agrippa I. He is actually of Jewish descent, unlike Herod the Great. Herod the Great was actually an Edomite. He's called an Idumean. That was just how the word Edom had gotten mutated over the centuries. So Herod Agrippa was half Idumean through his father, but his mother was a Jewish princess. And the Jews traced your Jewishness through the mother. So as far as the Jews were concerned, this Herod Agrippa was ethnically a Jew, which gave him a leg up on his father, Herod the Great. The Jews never quite accepted Herod the Great because he wasn't a Jew. Well, Herod Agrippa is a Jew, and when he first took power, he reduced taxes. He came out very strongly in favor of the Pharisees. He went to the temple regularly, did everything he could to please the Jews. So as a result, he was very popular with the Jewish community. And he was always on the lookout for what he could do next to keep the Jews happy with him. So what's he do? Well, he decides to kill some of the leaders of the church. Because by this time, the Jews are getting very nervous about these Christians among them. And they're ready for somebody to do something. The Christians have disrupted Jerusalem, and it's threatening the power base of the Sanhedrin and the Sadducees and so on. We've talked about that before. They're ready for somebody to do something. And so Herod realizes, I can make these people really happy if I kill a couple of prominent Christians. So that's what he does. He starts off by killing James. Now this is James the Apostle, the brother of John. Remember, the Zebedee the fisherman had two sons, James and John. They both became apostles. Well, that's who this James is, because there's another James going to show up later. He kills James, and that goes over so well, he has Peter arrested right before Passover, and he's planning to execute Peter right after Passover. It turns out that was actually kind of a thing. The Romans and the Greeks, everybody did that. After a major holiday, you'd have a big execution because you got a crowd around, and everybody's going to watch it, and they were short on options for entertainment, so that's kind of what this devolved into. So Peter's arrested. Oh, and by the way, you may be wondering how Agrippa, a Jew, right, could put people to death when the Sanhedrin could not put Jesus to death. You remember that from the Gospels? They did not have the power of execution, had to go to the Roman governor Pilate in order to get a writ of execution. The difference is, Agrippa is a king. He's been given that title, and a king has the power of execution. So Peter's seized, he's thrown in jail. Jerusalem was built on top of a hill. The temple was built on a hill inside that hill, if that makes sense. It was the highest place in Jerusalem. And up from the temple was what they called the upper city. That's where all the rich folks lived, the big homes. That was also where you found the Fortress Antonia. That was the Roman fortress where the governor would live, or in this case, where the king would live when he was in Jerusalem. And the fortress was not very far from the temple. So that's likely where Peter is being held, up in the upper city at the Fortress Antonia. And he's in the jail cell there. Herod has appointed 4 squads of 4 men each to look after him. 16 guys. Now, first thing that occurred to me is that's enough that you could rotate them, 4 or 6 hours at a time and make sure that whoever's on guard is alert. Because remember what happened back in chapter 4 when Peter and John were arrested and thrown in jail? Right? They got out. An angel let them loose. I have a feeling Herod Agrippa knew about that. And he's going to make sure that nobody lets Peter loose. In addition to the 4 squads of 4, during the night, Peter is chained to 2 guards, probably something around each wrist that is then, you've got a chain and then attached to the wrist of the 2 guards. He is as secure as anybody in that day and age could make him. He ain't getting out of there. Well, night comes, and an angel, and I don't know, there's a couple of things about this story that kind of strike me funny. The angel kind of has to whack Peter in the side to wake him up and say, get up, let's get your coat, let's get out of here. And Luke tells us that Peter thinks that he's in it having a dream. He doesn't understand what's going on at first. And when they get out on the street safely, and then the angel disappears. And only at that point does Peter realize this is real. So, like I said, he's likely in the upper city. He finds his way to the house of Mary. Now, whoever Mary was, she was fairly well off. Because if she was living close to the temple, or close to the fortress where Peter was held, that means she's likely in the upper city. That's the big homes where the rich people live. Also, she has a maid, which is a sign of some wealth. The whole church is gathered at her house, another sign of wealth, because only someone with a pretty big home would have a room big enough to gather the church in. So the church is there praying for Peter's safety, praying for his release, and Peter is, it's middle of the night, he comes and knocks on the door. And the maid answers. And she's shocked. She is so shocked, she slams the door in Peter's face and runs back to the church and says, Peter's outside, Peter's outside. And they're looking, oh, you're nuts. You saw his ghost if you saw anything. You just imagine all this. And while all that's going on, she's trying to convince him, no, he's really there. Peter's outside knocking on the door. And I don't care how soft he's knocking, at some point he's going to wake the neighbors, which wouldn't be a good thing. Because I imagine everybody in Jerusalem knew that Peter had been arrested. Peter was a fairly prominent figure. And he's been arrested, the execution's waiting, everybody knows this. So he's knocking on the door, and finally they come and open it up, and they can't believe it's him, and they go in, and then he tells them, you tell James and the brothers what's going on. Now this is the other James I was referring to. This is the James, the brother of Jesus, who's already become an important figure in the Jerusalem church, because Peter names him here. You tell James and the brothers what's happened, and then Peter makes himself scarce for obvious reasons. James shows up again later in Acts, where he's even more prominent. He appears to be the leader of the Jerusalem church. And that's really interesting, because when you read the Gospels, how did Jesus' brothers treat him? On one occasion, we're told they came to lay hands on him because they thought he'd lost his mind. And that's probably the nicest thing they thought about him. And now, not only has James come to believe in Jesus, he's become a leader of all those who believe in Jesus. It's quite a turnaround. Says something again about the power of the gospel. One more thing to note here, verse 19 in chapter 12. Herod had a thorough search made, didn't find him, cross-examined the guards, and ordered that they be executed. The way the Romans did it, and we know for a bunch of reasons that Herod Agrippa kind of set up his this isn't Roman soldiers, this is Herod's army. As a king, Herod's allowed to have his own army. But he ran it on Roman principles. And the Roman principle for guarding a prisoner was, if that prisoner escapes, whatever punishment he was up for, you get. So if it was a thief and they were going to cut off his hand or throw him in jail for a couple of years, whatever, that's what would happen to the guards. Peter is up for what? Execution. So when he disappears, the guards are executed. All right, Herod's death. Now, let's talk about the family of Herod for a minute. Does that not look like a mess? Herod the Great at the top, and this is his family tree. Now understand, there would be more of these red blocks. Those are his children. There would be more of these red blocks. I'm sorry, those are Those are his wives, excuse me, and then the children are next down. There'd be more of the children if Herod hadn't killed several of them. He was paranoid. And he'd wake up on the wrong side of the bed, and you looked at him funny, he'd kill you, or have you killed. He was afraid that everybody was out to get him. But anyway, and notice how many times the same woman gets shared between different male members of the family. I mean, they put the D in dysfunctional. Just an absolute mess this family was. But the one we're talking about today is Herod Agrippa I, right here. And you'll see the two arrows that come down and show that he imprisoned Peter and he executed James. This particular Herod played politics very, very well. When he was a younger man, he was living in Rome, and he actually partied with Caligula. You've heard of him, right? One of the Roman emperors, probably mentally insane. And I'm not making that up. He very likely was insane. Just we could Stan and I could stand up here and tell Caligula stories for a week, and we wouldn't run out of them. And they're all gross. But Herod partied with him, and as a result, Caligula made him king of two parts of Palestine. Only he didn't let him go home. He kept him in Rome. Well, Caligula dies, and Herod uses what influence he's got to make sure that Claudius becomes the next emperor. And Claudius rewarded him by giving him more territory in Palestine and actually let him go home to rule it. Herod actually only ruled from 41 to 44, AD 41 to 44. And I mentioned before that his mother was a Jewish princess. She was actually from the Hasmonean dynasty. You've heard of the Maccabees, right? That revolted against the government of the day. Well, the Maccabees wound up starting the Hasmonean dynasty. And Herod Agrippa I, his mother was from that family. That's the Jewish line, which made him accepted by the Jews. Now, Luke tells us that Herod was having a conflict with Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon, Tyre is right here, and Sidon, I believe, is a little farther up. They're both coastal cities. So they can fish, but there's not much else they can do for food for themselves, which means they're dependent on the land around them to furnish them food. Well, who controls the food? The king does. Somehow or other, Tyre and Sidon got crosswise with Agrippa. And this is not a famine situation. This is just Agrippa. Those two cities got crosswise with Agrippa, and he cut off their food supply. Well, how long is it going to take before the people of Tyre and Sidon figure we've got to settle this issue? So they made arrangements with one of Herod's advisors. Everybody would come down to Caesarea, another coastal town, the center of the Roman army in Palestine, and so on. And there were two places. One was the theater, and one was what they called the hippodrome, which was sort of like a miniature version of the Colosseum. That was where they would have horse races and other games, quote unquote. We're likely talking about the hippodrome because, as you'll see in a moment, the whole occasion was dependent on Herod being able to stand facing the sun. Well, if he was in the theater, which looked like, risers of seats, right? The sun would not have been able to hit him. It would have been behind those risers of seats. In the hippodrome, he would have been on an elevated area looking directly east. As the sun came up, it would hit him full force. Here's why that's important. They make a deal. The two cities make a deal with Herod's advisor that they're going to come and they're just going to slaver all over Herod, just butter him up one side and down the other, and praise him as and he would forgive them in his magnanimous royal gesture. So they're all gathered there, and Herod, Josephus tells us that Herod is wearing a robe that is woven throughout with silver threads, made of silver. So he's standing there in this robe, giving his little speech. The sun rises and strikes him, and what happens? There's this glow, this aura around him. It's their version of CGI effects in a movie. And the people see that, and they call out, "Oh, it's the voice of a god!" Because who else could stand and glow, right? Who else would have that kind of aura about them? It's the voice of a god, not a man. And Herod just laps it up. Herod just laps it up. He was He was very proud of his status and didn't miss an opportunity to show it off. He actually started a riot in Alexandria once because he was showing off how important he was, but he was a Jew, it didn't go over well in Alexandria, and he caused a ruckus just from showing off. So he's showing off here. The crowd says, the voice of a God, and immediately an angel strikes him down. He's eaten by worms and died. Josephus tells us a little more about it. Josephus says he collapsed immediately after the speech and died 5 days later with great, horrible stomach pains. Now, what's interesting is his father, Herod the Great, he went out of his way to persecute Jesus, didn't he? Tried to kill him. Remember, he's the one that had all the babies killed, trying to find Jesus in that number. Herod died a slow, lingering death with some horrible illness down in his groin and lower belly. It's kind of interesting that both of these two who attacked Jesus and his church were struck down before their time. There is no earthly power that's going to stop the spread of the gospel. Now, this is up to you, but both of their deaths are considered medical mysteries. We don't really know what they died from. And if you Google the death of Herod the Great or the death of Herod Agrippa I, you can find some fascinating articles where doctors are saying, well, it could be this, it could be that. But what you really find out is just how horrible, and disgusting, and gross their illnesses probably were. They did not die pleasant deaths. Did not die pleasant deaths at all. Now, one last thing. This is what I call foreshadowing. Look at verse 25. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, that's taking the collection down to Jerusalem, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them who? John, also called Mark. Now, it was his mom's house that Peter went to when the angel got him out of the prison. But where do Paul and Barnabas, Saul and Barnabas, and John Mark, where do they show up next? The next chapter, the Antioch church starts sending out missionaries. And who are the first ones they send? Saul and Barnabas, and John Mark goes with them as a helper. That's why I say we're doing some foreshadowing here. All right, that's it. Leonard will be here. Will be up here next week, and he's got the next 3 months, right? So we'll resume Acts in May. We'll pick up in chapter 13 in May, and over that quarter we'll finish up the book. Appreciate your attention. Thank you. Bye-bye.